in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 1 as we continue our study through the Word. Now, you'll remember that the close of 1 Samuel, we finished up 1 Samuel last time. In the close of 1 Samuel, we saw the death of King Saul. You'll remember that the medium, Samuel, was called up and through the medium, the witch of Endor. And you'll remember that Samuel told him that tomorrow in battle you will die with your sons. And so you will recall that the Philistines had gathered together and that they were aligned against the Israelites. And so Saul went out onto the battlefield, led the troops out, and you'll remember that in fact he did fall, that the archer's arrows penetrated him. And you'll remember that his armor bearer was there with him, and the arrows hadn't killed him immediately. And so he knew that he was fatally wounded, that he was mortally wounded, and as the battle was continuing on, he didn't want to be left to fall into the hands of the enemy. No doubt they would torture him and they would drag him around and mutilate him. And so, seeking to spare that humiliation, he asked his armor bearer to pierce him, and the armor bearer wouldn't pierce him. He was young and he was afraid, and so Saul falls on his own sword. And you remember that then his armor bearer also fell upon his sword. And the next day after the battle, you remember that as the Philistines had come out to go through the army and to collect weapons and all, go through the dead, that they came across King Saul's body, and they took and chopped off his head and sent his head along with his armor to the various different cities and the celebrations that were going on. And they took and they pinned his wall onto the city wall. And you will remember Beth-shean, and so you'll remember that the Israelites, the men came out and they took his body down and they burned it and then buried his ashes, and so that was the end that we saw of King Saul. And as we come into 2 Samuel chapter 1, really it just begins right with the account of King Saul and his son Jonathan, and now King David, and so picks up right where we left off. So let's jump back in now to looking at the study of David's life as it is recorded for us in 1 and 2 Samuel. And it says now in verse 1, 2 Samuel chapter 1, "Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days in Ziklag, and on the third day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And so it was when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself." Now, you'll remember here that as the Israelites were battling the Philistines, remember how David and his army, they were in Philistine territory, and they had been given Ziklag as a place, and David was not where he was supposed to be. And you remember that the king tried to take him into the battle against the Israelites, and it was the other lords of the Philistines that wouldn't let David and his men go out onto the battlefield. So you'll remember how they sent him back to Ziklag. And you remember as his men had journeyed 3 days, and as they came to Ziklag, they saw now smoke, and it wasn't the fires of the cooking fires, but the city had been razed, and David's wives, children, and all of the people, all the wives, all the children, all the livestock had been taken by the Amalekites. The Amalekites, they're a Bedouin kind of society. They would travel around and they were opportunistic, and so they took advantage of the departure of the army to go and to join with the Philistines. And so David, you remember, he chases after the Amalekites and wipes them out. And you remember that he retrieves all of the plunder as well as all of the the wives and the children were all fine, and they had come back now. So we see that they have returned back. All of them have journeyed back to Ziklag. And once again, the picture isn't that they just went back into their homes. The picture is that it had been burned and wiped out, and so it is the post-cleanup of all that had happened. They had gone through a great ordeal, being captured and dragged off and then rescued and restored, and all the herds and everybody getting back. And so suddenly now, as David is there with his wives, children, rest of the people, there comes this man into the city now, and he is in the traditional sign of mourning. His clothes are torn and rent, and dust is on his head. So you know immediately that something bad has happened. This is not somebody carrying good news, but this is somebody who is carrying bad news. So immediately in the distance as they're approaching, you know this is bad news that's coming. And so they receive this individual, and he falls to the ground now, and he prostrates himself. Now, it's interesting here because this 2 Samuel begins with after the death of Saul. And Joshua, the book of Joshua begins with after the death of Moses. And the book of Judges begins with after the death of Joshua. And here 2 Samuel begins with after the death of Saul. And so we see here that now we are moving into this new period that is going to be looking at the life now of King David, as he is going to now step up into the office that he had been anointed for by Samuel some 15 to 20 years earlier, is when Samuel shows up at the house of Jesse and anoints him to be king. And so from the time there until now, we see that Saul has been the king, and so David now is in the territory of the Philistines, though. In verse 3 it says, "And David said to him, 'Where have you come from?' And so he said to him, 'I have escaped from the camp of Israel.'" Now, no doubt David was already concerned with how the battle was going to go, because he saw the size of the army that the Philistines had gathered together, all the lords of the Philistines, when they had paraded them out and when they were on their way to go into battle against the Israelites. And no doubt David was glad to be spared from that battle, being on the side of the Philistines, but also David would have liked to have fought against the Philistines with the Israelites, with his own people. And so, knowing that there is this great army that's going to attack your people, this would have weighed upon him. And so, as he now hears that there is news from this battle, he is wanting to know how this battle is going to turn out, because he knows that this battle is being waged. He had been involved in his own battle of recovering his own family and all of his possessions, but now suddenly there's this individual who says that they've come from the camp of Israel. And verse 4, "And then David said to him, 'How did the matter go? Please tell me.' And he answered, 'The people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also.'" And so we see that now he brings a word of the information of what has happened in the battle, but he is expecting that David is going to be pleased with that news. That David is now, he knows that Saul has been chasing after David, and that David has been hiding because of the persecution. So he believes in his heart that he's coming with this news. Your persecution is over. You are free, and you now can return to your own homeland. So though he is telling him that King Saul and Jonathan are dead, he believes that that's going to be good news. But you'll remember the friendship that David had with Jonathan, and their great kindred spirit that they had. And now Jonathan has fallen, and King Saul has fallen. And so here we see that David now is not encouraged with this news, but we see that there is just a sadness. Verse 5, and so David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead?" He wants confirmation. Was this heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend? Or, give me the source of your information. How accurate is this information? And in verse 6 it says, "Then the young man who told him said, as I happened by chance to be on Mount Gilboa, there was Saul leaning on his spear. And indeed, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. And now when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here I am." So the story that this young man says is, I was out picking daisies one day, and suddenly there was this man leaning on his spear, and the chariots, they were following hard behind him, and he called to me, and so I answered him. In verse 8, and he said to me, "Who are you?" So I answered him, "I am an Amalekite." Now, you will remember that the irony of this situation here is that the Amalekites were the nation that had attacked the Israelites when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt and were being led by Moses. And Joshua went and defeated the Amalekites, but the Amalekites attacked them from the rear. And that's where the elderly and the sick and the children were, in the rear. And so they had come up from behind and they had attacked him. And there was the judgment that God had told Joshua, that after you enter into the land, that judgment is going to come upon the Amalekites, and they are going to be wiped out because of this atrocity that they had perpetrated against the Israelites. You remember that it was Samuel that then goes to King Saul and tells King Saul that now is the time to go and to wipe out the Amalekites, and they were now being judged for that very sin against the nation Israel. And you remember that it was now the instruction by Samuel to leave nothing, that all was to be destroyed. They weren't to take any property from them. This is a judgment from the Lord, and so they are not to profit whatsoever. And you remember that that's when King Saul disobeys and does not kill all the Amalekites, does not wipe out all of their livestock, but brings the choice livestock back with him and cherry picks all of this. And this was the disobedience to the Lord that now caused King Saul to be cut off as the very king. Now, who is it that comes upon him as he is dying? An Amalekite. The very people that should have been wiped out in judgment by Saul, had Saul been obedient to the word of the Lord. And so we see that his sin now has come full circle, in that there is this Amalekite that comes upon him. And so he says in verse 9, "And he said to me again, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. So I stood over him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord." So he says that he now took and killed King Saul, and that because he could not live, and that King Saul had asked him to do that. So what are we to make of this? Because we had just seen at the end of 1 Samuel that Saul had fallen on his own sword. Well, there's one of two different choices, two different opinions that we can have of this situation. One is that when the armor bearer would not kill him, King Saul falls upon his own sword, but it may have been that it did not pierce his heart. Now, normally you line up the sword with your heart, and then when you fall upon it, it ends your life very quickly. It could have been that King Saul was a bad aim. And that now, he wounds himself, but here he is stuck on his sword, and he's still not dead yet. And this Amalekite comes upon him, and it could be that this is what indeed did happen. But there is also something else about the Amalekites. The Amalekites, they were known for being these Bedouins that would just kind of roam around. And one of the things that they would do is that they would scavenge during the battles the dead and go and collect everything and use that to go and to sell and to make money. And so it is very likely, he says, I just happened to be where a big battle was going on. Well, the Amalekites would come in and would do this. So very likely he was a scavenger that was there. And it is possible that he came upon him while King Saul was alive. But it is also possible that he came the next day and was just out there pillaging and comes across King Saul, sees the gold crown that's on his helmet and the bracelet, and he takes them off and believes that if he goes and brings these to King David, that David is going to reward him handsomely. And that if he tells King David that he himself killed King Saul, that his reward might end up being double. So it could be that this Amalekite has come across these things, did not kill King Saul. King Saul died exactly as we saw, and is now lying in order to be able to increase his reward, thinking that King David is going to be very happy with this news and with this information. In verse 11 it says, and therefore David took hold of his own clothes and tore them. And so did all the men who were with him, and they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And so here we see that this Amalekite might have been a little bit concerned at this point, because he probably was expecting a different reaction from David than seeing him mourn and tear his clothes and put ashes upon his head. And so they fasted and they were just crying out before the Lord until evening, until the sun went down. Verse 13, and then David now said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. And so David said to him, how was it that you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And then David called one of the young men and said, go near and execute him. And he struck him so that he died. Now, the scriptures tell us that we are not to touch the anointed. It says, touch not my anointed and do my prophet no harm. And we see that Saul was definitely the anointed of God. Now, clearly that anointing had left Saul some time ago, but David still had respect for Saul because he had been anointed with oil to be the king over Israel. And this Amalekite has declared out of his own mouth that he himself has killed the king of the nation of Israel. In verse 16, so David said to him, your blood is on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Now, we see that if in fact the Amalekite was telling the truth, and he did, wasn't lying, because we'll never know whether or not, but if he was in fact had come across King Saul, and King Saul had missed his heart and was now there, and this Amalekite does kill him, then it is interesting because we also see in this the typology. Now, the Amalekites in the scriptures, the Amalekites are a typology of the life in the flesh, in the flesh. And we see that we are called to crucify the flesh and to not be underneath the control of the flesh. And so we see that there was the instruction for King Saul to go and to destroy the flesh. And in the end, we see that his failure to destroy the flesh, we see the flesh now destroys him. And so we see this lesson of typology here for us as well. That the flesh's desire is to draw us away from the Lord and to just seek personal fulfillment, personal satisfaction. We are either serving the Lord or we are serving our flesh. And every single day, there is that conscious choice of who we are going to be in obedience to today. And so, here we see that King Saul is told, wipe out the flesh, crucify the flesh. And the failure to do that is going to have its consequences. And here we see ultimately, scripturally and by typology, the destruction now of Saul because of his failure to do that. In verse 17 it says, Then David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. And indeed it is written in the book of Jasher. And so here we see the public grief of David over Saul and Jonathan, and he writes this song of the bow, and it starts off verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, and how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, and proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Now, David doesn't know this, but it's too late. Because remember that they took the head of David and they also took his armor and they brought it to the various different cities. But here, David doesn't want the enemies to be rejoicing over King Saul's death. And you remember how when King Saul would come back from the battlefield, the women would come out and dance, and you remember that Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s, and all, and the jubilation of the victory. And here David is immediately concerned that the enemies would be rejoicing over this the death of Saul and of Jonathan, and in his heart he just can't bear to think of that taking place. On verse 21 he says, O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Interesting, he says, O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. And when the nation of Israel came back, and Mount Gilboa, it's interesting, because on the north side of Mount Gilboa, it doesn't get very much rain there at all. And when the nation of Israel reformed itself and came back into existence, they went and they planted trees throughout all of Israel, millions of trees that they planted. But when they came to Mount Gilboa, they left a whole area unplanted because of this right here, because of the scriptures that said, let Mount Gilboa, let no dew be there, nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. And if you travel to Israel today, when you go by Mount Gilboa, you'll see that there is the barrenness of Mount Gilboa. And to this day, the people of Israel, they know that Mount Gilboa, this is where King Saul perished in battle with Jonathan. In verse 23, Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. Now, remember when the nation of Israel, when they wanted a king, one of the reasons they wanted a king was to be able to have a national army that could give them security and safety. And underneath Saul, they had tremendous victories. They had tremendous success. And Jonathan was a tremendous general in Saul's army. And Jonathan and Saul, they did tremendous things to bring safety to their homeland and to bring prosperity to them as well. Now, we've been focusing on the Saul side of that's been chasing after David these years, but also in these years, they have been delivering them from the hand of their enemies as well. In verse 25, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. And I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. And how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. And so he is saddened over the friendship that he had with Jonathan, and so here he talks about this deep friendship that he had. That in here there was this bond of brotherhood that was even greater than the love of a woman. Now, there are those who would say, well, this represents a homosexual relationship, and they use this verse here and suggest that to try and support that. But here's what I want you to know, that in the Old Testament it talks about the fact that homosexuality is an abomination unto the Lord. And what we know is that David is talked about as a man that chases after God's own heart and that he is a righteous man. So there is no way that that could be true in the context of the Old Testament here. And so that is just absolutely seeing into the Scriptures what you want to see into it with absolutely no support whatsoever. And so here we see that the Scriptures say that they had this great friendship, this bond of friendship of these two men. It ends with how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. And so here we see the song of the bow and just this dirge to Saul and to Jonathan. And so 2 Samuel chapter 2 begins now with the continuation. It says in verse 1 that it happened after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, where shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Now, here we see that the next thing that David does, he's in the territory of the Philistines. And now we see that King Saul has perished. And so the very next question that David has is, what should I do? And we see him doing the right thing. What does he do? He goes and inquires of the Lord. And that's what we should be doing, is whenever we are seeking direction in our life, we need to be inquiring of the Lord. And certainly this was a key to success in David's life. There are times that David didn't inquire of the Lord, but for the majority of the time we see David inquiring of the Lord, seeking the Lord's will and seeking the Lord's direction. He had been in this period of being backslidden, but now he was right with the Lord. You'll remember that he had inquired of the Lord whether he should go chase after the Amalekites, and the Lord had told him to go, and he had brought the men. Remember, they were talking about killing David now because look at what following him had cost them all, and the Lord told him they're going to recover everything, and let the men know that and go, and they had in fact. And so David had turned around. Now he had hit his low. He had bottomed out there as he came back from being rejected by the Philistine lords to go and attack the Israelites. And then he started now to inquire of the Lord. And here we see now, next that he inquires of the Lord. And he says, shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? So here again we see that he is not in the right territory, and so the Lord tells him to go up, and then he asks him, where? Where should I go? Where do I start? And he says, Hebron. The Lord directs him to Hebron. Verse 2, and so David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household, and so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. And so this is a town in the mountains of Judah, and we see it's between Beersheba and Jerusalem, about 20 miles. There's 20 miles apart from those two. And we see that Hebron has a rich history in the Old Testament. We see that Abraham spent much of his time in Mamre, and that is in the area of Hebron. It was there that Abram's name was changed to Abraham, and it was at Hebron that the angels revealed to Abraham that he would have a son who was to be called Isaac. Sarah dies at Hebron, and so we see that Hebron was designated as one of the cities of refuge. So interesting that David now comes back and is going to dwell in a city of refuge, and he rules from Hebron during the first 7 years of his reign, and then after which he establishes Jerusalem as the capital. And so Hebron becomes the place, the capital of his period of governance during those early years. And verse 4, it says, "Then the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. They were the ones who went and took Saul's body off of the walls of Bethshean and had buried him." And so David now is going to reward them. We see that it says that David was anointed king. Now, this is the second time that he was anointed. Remember that Samuel was the one that came and first anointed him, but that was quite a number of years back. This is the second time that he's anointed, but he's anointed just by Judah. And then there is going to be a third anointing that is going to take place when he is anointed as king over the entire nation. Right now you're going to see that the nation is going to divide. There are going to be those that are underneath the house of Saul, and then there's Judah, and David is from Judah. And Judah immediately, they proclaim him to be the king. Anointed by Samuel, he's the rightful king. But there is also going to be now one of the sons of Saul is going to be installed, and we're going to see that there is going to be a division that is going to take place. But in the end, we are going to see that David is going to be anointed a third time as king over the entire nation. In verse 5 it says, "So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and have buried him." And so David showed gratitude to the men who had risked their life and had marched all night, and they had given honor to Saul and to Jonathan, and so they were the ones that came and took their bodies and cremated them. And they buried the ashes. Verse 6, "And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay you this kindness, because you have done this thing. And now therefore let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead. And also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." And so he lets them know that he has been anointed king by those of the house of Judah, and he sends that blessing to them. Verse 8, "But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all Israel." So Judah takes and anoints David king, and we see that Abner now, who was the general, he was the commander of Saul's army, he now takes a son of Saul here named Ishbosheth, and he now declares that he is the king. Now the Lord is the one that made David king. But here we see that it's a commander that makes Ishbosheth king. So we see the work of man versus the work of God at play here. And seeking to maintain his power and his authority, he now takes this fourth son, Saul's youngest, and places him in authority. Now, Abner, you remember that Abner is the very one who was supposed to be guarding Saul when David sneaks down into the camp, and you remember that he chastises Abner for not guarding the king. This is the same Abner here, and so Abner now sets up this rival to King David, and it says, verse 10, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Now, we see here that he was not killed in Saul's last battle, and so there are various different opinions as to how that could be. But here we see that Saul reigned now for over 40 years. He was born after his inauguration as king. So he's 40 years old when he begins to reign. He reigns after Saul was dead, and he's born after Saul becomes king. So we know that Saul's reign was at least for a stretch of 4 decades or 40 years. And here we see in the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So this describes a period of time that David had his headquarters in Hebron for the first 2 years of this time. He ruled over Judah alone. And Ishbosheth, propped up by Abner, ruled the rest of Israel. And then after the 7 years and 6 months, David moves to Jerusalem. Verse 12. Now Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool of Gibeon. And so they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. So here we have the nation of Israel. We have these 2 kings. And it's been peaceable up until this point. But now, suddenly, this general from Ishbosheth brings some men, brings an army over to Gibeon. And so David sends out Joab and some of his army to go to the spring. And now they're on the opposite side of this pool, the opposite side of this spring. There's their men over there, and David's got his men on the other side. And Joab is one of the 400 men who had joined David there at the cave of Adullam, and he has been and has a long career as David's chief general. So we've got the 2 commanders of the respective kings, and they've got some men that are with them, and they're sitting across from this pool on each side. So you can just see this picture, of the 2 that are there, and now they're going to converse across the pool here, with their armies on each side. Verse 14, and then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab says, let them arrive. Let them arise. So they're going to have some type of a competition. So you take 12 of your young men, I'll take 12 of my young men. And I think this was the first football game. I'm not sure. Okay, later on it becomes 11, but here they first started with 12. But it was 12 against 12, and they're gonna compete in some way, shape, or form. It's not told us. But we're going to see that it rapidly disintegrates. Look at what happens, verse 15. It says, "So they arose and went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. And so they were we're not told exactly what they were supposed to do, but here's what happens. It says, and each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. And so here's the picture, they are so filled with with hostility towards one another, that instead of doing whatever they were supposed to be doing, when they got close enough to each other, they just went at it. And so you have these 12 men, each paired off in two. So you've got 24 men in these 12 groupings, and each one grabbed the other one by the hair, and simultaneously they both killed each other with the sword. And so you had these 12 pairs of men that now simultaneously kill each other, and they all fall down. And so what happens after that is then that's it. Then it's the bench is empty, and now everybody gets into it, and the whole battle now begins. Now, remember, up until this point, there hasn't been bloodshed that has happened. It's been a political divide. It has been a tension of these two different kings, but they've never ever crossed with one another up until this moment now that this occurs. And so it says that now they grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword, verse 16, is in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. And therefore that place was called the Field of Sharp Swords. That's a creative name. The Field of Sharp Swords, which is in Gibeon. Verse 17, and it says, and so there was a very fierce battle that day. And Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Now, remember that it was the men of Ishbosheth's army that had come over into Gibeon and had kind of instigated this altercation between the two groups. So there's this fierce battle, and David's men they gain victory before over Abner and the men from Ishbosheth's army. Now, it says in verse 18, now the three sons of Zeruiah were there. Joab. So Joab is the commander of David's army. And the commander of David's army has two brothers. It says Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel was as fleet of foot as a wild gazelle. So this guy was a marathon runner, possibly did triathlons also, we're not sure. But he can run. And so it says in verse 19, and so Asahel pursued Abner. Abner is in defeat in the battle. And then he takes his army and he withdraws. But Asahel is fast. He is a runner. And so he takes off after Abner and the army as they are in retreat. And so Asahel, it says, verse 19, pursued Abner. And in going, he did not turn to the right hand or to the left from following Abner. So they have been routed. They are, heading back to their own territory. And it says, and Asahel pursued him, and he wouldn't turn to the left or to the right. In verse 20, then Abner looked behind him, and he said, are you Asahel? And he answered, I am. And Abner said to him, turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and lay hold of one of the young men, and take his armor for yourself. But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So we see that Asahel now is so enraged by the battle that has taken place and the slaughter of the men and this aggression by Abner's army that even though they're in retreat, he takes off after them. And his desire is to kill Abner and to take his armor and bring it back. And so Abner tells him, Abner is warning him, and he says, look, stand back. Just head back to the rest of the men there. He says, and you know what I'll do? I'll pick one of my men and take his armor. You can have his armor, and you can go. So he kind of offers him an appeasement to send him back with some armor and head back. But we see that Asahel won't turn aside from following him. In verse 22, so Abner said again to Asahel, turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brother Joab? Now, here we see that Abner knows Joab. Joab is the commander of the army. He knows that Asahel is his brother. And he recognizes that they are still Israelites. And he recognizes that he really doesn't want to kill Asahel, but Asahel is intent on coming and killing him. And so he tells him, back off, head back. If I kill you, then how am I going to face your brother Joab? And he sees the complications that this would take. Now, I don't believe that Abner or Joab recognized what was going to happen when they put the 12 men together, and then these guys went at it, and then it spilled into what it had become. But Abner recognizes now that if he kills Joab's brother, that this is going to perpetuate, and this is going to possibly have dire circumstances to the division between them. And so it's one thing when an unexpected melee breaks out. It's another thing now where there is a direct confrontation that Abner is involved in, and he recognizes the relational complications that would take place. So he is trying to avoid this conflict between them. And so he again asks him, turn aside from following me. We do not want to lock horns here. In verse 23 it says, however, he refused to turn aside. And therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of the spear, so that the spear came out of his back. So we have full detail here on this. It says, and he fell down there and died on the spot. And so it was that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still. So there were others that were behind him that were pursuing Abner and his men, but Asahel was the fastest, and then he perishes and dies, and then everybody else, as they come up, they just stop right there where Asahel has fallen. And here we see that Abner's plea didn't work. He was pleading for Asahel, go back, stop pursuing me, stop chasing me. And Asahel was single-minded in his determination to kill Abner and possibly crush the army. And so here we see that Abner kills Asahel in self-defense. It was the only thing that he could do. But yet we see that he was concerned with and will end up having to face his brother Joab. And Joab is, of course, going to make it now his passion to avenge his brother's death against Abner here. And so Joab never forgets Abner's actions against his brother. And so verse 24, it says, Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner. So the two brothers now are chasing down Abner. And the sun was going down before they came to the hill of Ammah, which is before Giah by the road of the wilderness of Gibeon. And now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner and became a unit and took their stand on top of the hill. So they're being chased. They go up to the hill, to the top of the hill. They run up to the top of the hill, and now they make their stand there. In combat, in battle, you always want to be fighting downhill. So when they realize that they cannot outrun this army, then what they do is they go up and take the high ground, and they came together as a unit. And now here is the the army that is there. And then Abner, who's on top with the men, called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" And so Joab now, with his soldiers, Abner calls down to him and says, "Call your men off. We're in retreat. We're departing. Why are you continuing to pursue us? And are we going to continue to spill Israelite blood?" Civil war is always so tragic when a nation turns on itself and all of the dead are of the same nation. And one of the great heartaches of Abraham Lincoln, president, as involved in the Civil War, and recognizing that every single casualty is an American. Every single casualty is an American. And wanting to end the war, but also wanting truth and righteousness to prevail. And so hanging in that balance. And so here we see that Abner is with a group of Israelites, and there's another group of Israelites that are down there. And so he calls out and asks for peace. Let us now stop. Let us stand down. And so he says, "How long will it be until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren? We are Israelites." And so I believe that Abner here is in a situation that it had gotten out of control. This was not their intent. It was maybe to go into saber rattle and maybe to intimidate and all. But now this has escalated way beyond the expectation that was going to transpire. And now we see that Abner is calling Joab that it wouldn't escalate any farther. And so Joab responds in verse 27. And Joab said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken, unless you had asked for peace right now, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." And so Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still and did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. So Joab blows the trumpet and withdraws the men now. And it says in verse 29, "And Abner and his men went on all that night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through all Bithron, and they came to Mahanaim." And so Joab returned from pursuing Abner. And when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. So David's army, they had lost 20 altogether, 19 men plus Joab's brother Asahel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who died. So it was a tremendous rout that took place within the battle. 360 men on the one side, only 20 on the other side. And so, verse 32, it says, "Then they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem." So they stopped by in Bethlehem and they buried Asahel. And then Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at daybreak. They returned back to Hebron. So as we close our study here, just a reminder that we see David going and inquiring of the Lord and just seeking to do God's will. And as we close out our study and as we close out this year, may that be our prayer. May we just inquire of the Lord, "Lord, what would you have us to do? How can we continue to grow in our relationship with you?" And just seek that direction. Just seek the Lord's instruction. Every single one of us is being molded and shaped into the image and likeness of Christ. And so there is work that God is trying to do in you. There's work that God is trying to do in me. And what I want to do in my life is I want to cooperate with what God wants to do in my life. I want to know, Lord, what do you want me to do? What am I doing well? Because God will give you kisses on the forehead, and He'll let you know the things that you're doing good, and then He'll show you the things that He wants us to rely more on Him in order to get victory. He's not wanting us to go and do it. He's wanting us to do it through His strength, through His power. And so that's a learning process of not responding to things the way that we always have in the past. That's what growth is when we learn how to not do what has always been done. As God starts to show us to call out to Him, to be armored up, to be more equipped in the morning, to be more strengthened each and every day, to press in deeper or to call out or to avoid. And so He'll give us a battle plan in our life to be able to overcome whatever it is that He's working on in our lives. And so that process of being molded. So there is the twofold. There is one, Lord, I want to be changed into the image and likeness of Christ. And then secondly, Lord, use me to bless others, to continue to learn how to bless others. And so as He continues to change us, then also we see that we become more effective in the one thing that He's called us to do. And the one thing that He's called us to do is love. He's called us to love. And so may this next year, 2016, may it be our goal. I know it is mine, but collectively, may it be our goal to have more love come out of our life in 2016 than has ever come out of our life in any previous year. And so in order to do that, God will need to continue to do a work in us, and then we need to cooperate with that work that God is doing. And with those two things in place, we will see that will become a reality by the close of 2016. And the reason that I can say that is because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that's God's will for our life, for every single one of us. Now, how it actually plays out and where it is and all of that I don't know. But I do know that wherever we are, whatever our circumstances, that God wants us to be loving people, first with the love that we're able to, that we're just capable of, and then secondly, when that hits its limitation, then it is the vastness, the inexhaustible resource of His love through us on to others. And so may God help us. May God teach us. May He grow us. May we be patient and long-suffering with one another as we learn how to grow in this grace of living out our faith, of loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then loving others. Let's pray. Father, teach us, help us. We can't do this on our own. We have such shallow supplies of love that is so conditional, God. But You have the infinite resource of pure agape love, which is not conditional. And so, God, we need that resource. And You gladly pour that into us when we just tilt our face up to You and just ask. And so, God, would You bless us? Would You fill us afresh with Your agape love, with Your pure, perfect love? And God, may we just simply go forth and love others. So, Lord, bless us now. We call upon You. We cry out to You, Lord. We thank You. And it's in Jesus' name we pray.